Welcome, everybody. My name is Christina Egan. I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Portland Council of Governments. And today we are kicking off our summer webinar series on racial equity. Why is GPCOG doing this work? Well, government at the federal, state, regional, and local levels has had a major role in creating the economy and the social world that we live in. In the course of history, government agencies may have made investments and set policy that explicitly in the past and implicitly, more recently, have disadvantaged Black people, Indigenous tribal people, and people of color. In the planning world, if you've studied planning like I have, the most visible example of this is highways that have been built through inner cities, which have displaced immigrant communities of all ethnicities, as well as Black people. All of us who serve in government are stewards. We're responsible for serving all people in this region. And we have a critical role to play in government, and this requires us to deepen our understanding of the inequities and the unfairness that we have in our region, and also to take intentional actions to advance racial equity. With the death of George Floyd in May, the US has seen the largest protest movement in history, according to several polls that I read last week. We are being asked by this movement to understand and to take action. Now, the Greater Portland Council of Governments' work is to build sustainable and shared prosperity, and I want to focus in on this word shared for just a moment. To me, it means that we are all better off when everyone has an equal opportunity to learn, to earn, and to be healthy. Our member cities and towns in this region have a history of working together on many issues, from waste management to homelessness to building the economy. Just last summer, we worked on an issue that has a racial equity component, and this was to find homes for the asylum seekers that came here from Africa. The staff, the managers, and staff at many of our cities and towns and our electeds worked to find housing for our new neighbors. And many residents opened their homes in our region through the Host Homes program to take people in. We are a welcoming place. But we are also a place where it's harder to thrive if you're a person of color. In Maine, we have just 2% of our population, which is Black. But as you may have seen in the headlines, 24% of all of the COVID cases are with Black people. That is 20 times higher than the white rate of contracting the virus. And this is the nation's worst racial disparity in the whole country. The state's Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Maine tribal populations said that this disparity in the COVID crisis is not surprising given the other pre-existing racial disparities we have in Maine. If you are a woman of color with a college degree, you earn only slightly more than a white man with a high school degree in Maine. Black Mainers are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, and they compose 11% of our prison population. And this disproportionate amount of punishment begins at the school level, with Black students almost 2.5 times more likely to be suspended. 25% of Blacks in Maine live in poverty, which compares with 11% of whites, and 19% of our homeless population, which we have a large share of here in the Greater Portland area, is Black. I wanted to ground us in some data, but I also wanted to share this quote that I read in the BDN from a protester about police brutality. He said, while some state lawmakers have called for more information to pinpoint where prejudice occurs in the criminal justice system, organizers said they don't necessarily need more data to know that race plays a role in policing. They wonder why their stories are not enough. So to help all of us who are white better put ourselves in the shoes of a Black person in Maine, Tori Pelletier on our staff is going to share her story of growing up as a Black girl in Brunswick and then a Black woman in Maine. Many of you already know Tori. Today is actually her 1-year anniversary with GPCOG. She's been a huge asset to the region. I know many of you who've worked with her know that. She has done many events planning, many coffees with COG. She's done our office management, of course. But since the pandemic started, she has helped out with our small business loan program, and she is now the project manager of our racial equity work. We believe that Tori is actually the first person of color that GPCOG has hired in our 50-year history, and we are really glad to have her. Before I turn it over to Tori, to introduce the panel and share her story, I need to say one thing, which is that GPCOG staff and board, we aren't experts on race and justice. This is new territory for our agency, and we don't actually know what we don't know. I expect, unfortunately, that we are going to make mistakes and missteps as we convene and support community dialogues around race and equity in our region. All of us on this call come to this challenging and emotionally charged issue with different backgrounds and experiences. And my hope at GPCOG is that we can all dive into learning together. We can forgive each other for mistakes, and we can try to find ways that we can take intentional action to advance racial equity. With that, I'd like to invite Tori to share her story.
Hello, thank you, Christina, so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for being here and for spending your afternoon with us. I'm looking at the attendees right now. It looks like we have 132 people, which is fantastic. So again, thank you for being here. I know we have elected officials. It looks like we have some GPCOG stakeholders and members of the public. So it's really an exciting time. And before we really dive into the content, I just wanted to share my story. Some of you may know it, some of you may not, but I wanted to just take a little bit of time to tell you all who I am. And I know I may not look like it, but I am a local Mainer, and I'm really, really proud of that. I was born in Miami, but I was adopted when I was only a few weeks old. And so I have been in Maine ever since. And some of my favorite pastimes include eating steamers at Harriseket, going ice fishing on East Grand Lake, having pizza and fries from the Old Orchard Pier, and soaking in the amazing scenery as much as I can, making my out-of-state friends very, very jealous. I love this state, and for the most part, it has always loved me back. But that's not to say that being a Black woman in a very white state does not come with its own set of difficulties. And it really wasn't until, it wasn't until school that I really realized how different I was. I was the only Black person in school for years, and the questions that I received were endless. I've been asked why I don't bruise, if I feel pain the same way that a white person does. I've been asked what it feels like to be a slave, and a variety of other really shocking questions. And while these uncomfortable comments and questions would most often end with me crying in the guidance counselor's office or on the school bus, I did have a great group of friends, and I did trudge forward to middle school and high school, where I was one of maybe 6 Black people in school at that point. The comments took a more severe turn then, as everything in high school often does. And while I look back on my time fondly, I was not spared from the racism that seeped in. I was compared to a zoo animal. A monkey and an ape are the most common names that I've been called. I've also been compared to food, a Tootsie Roll, a chocolate cake, and burnt toast, just to name a few. And I've been on the receiving end of relentless bullying about my hair, how I speak, how dark and undesirable my skin color was, among many things. And it was around that time that I realized it didn't matter necessarily how nice I was or how well I did in school or out on the soccer field. The color of my skin was always the topic, and it was really hard for me to form an identity outside of that. All of the micro and macro aggressions, however, really pale in comparison to being called the N-word, which has been said to me on multiple occasions here in Maine as a kid and even now as an adult. In my experience of being called this word, it's almost always from a complete stranger, and weirdly enough, it always seems to happen when I'm in the best of moods and having a great time. The scenario really hasn't changed much. It normally consists of me out with my friends, minding my own business, and someone here in Maine at that moment just disgusted by my presence and deciding that I am too Black to exist in their white space. I've been in scenarios where it's been said directly to my face, or just loud enough that I hear it and I see the laughter directed at me when I lock eyes with the person who said it. Each time, my night is not only ruined, but so is my self-esteem. And I spend days building myself back up again, comforting myself with reminders that the person maybe had too much to drink, or they're just trying to show their boldness in front of their friends. I convince myself that I am not that word. And also, even though I convince myself that there are many other people in this state that love and support me, despite what that one person said. It does help numb the pain, and after a few days, I always bounce back. However, I unfortunately can never forget the incident, and it joins the reel of countless other experiences of racism that I've dealt with here in Maine that I make a mental note to try and move on from. I remind myself that it is not Maine as a whole, it's just a few people who live here. But I would be lying if I said the paranoia doesn't seep in as I run my errands the next day. And thoughts of whether or not I belong here in Maine start to take shape in my mind. I start thinking, does everyone hate me here? Will I ever be more than just a random Black person that nobody wants to get to know? Will I always be judged for my skin color, which is something that's entirely outside of my control? Whenever I tell people about the several times I've been called a slur here in Maine or just experienced racism in any form, the response is often the same about what they, a white person, would have done if they were me, and most often includes some type of altercation. Did you get in their face? They ask me. Did you get physical? Did you scream in their face? Because I would have gotten physical. I would have screamed in their face. That's not okay. And I smile and I nod, allowing them to be the hero of the scenario they'll likely never be in, while also envious that they have the luxury to even consider any type of altercation as a viable option to combat racism. I then give them my response, asking them to set the scene with me. Imagine me getting in a white person's face, screaming and yelling. My race has been historically and constantly judged as aggressors, as thugs, as animals. The cops would be called, and given what we've seen play out between police officers and Black Americans, I'm not entirely confident on how the scenario would end or whether or not I would live to tell you about it. When I experience racism here, I am angry, yes, but as a Black woman, I have to make a conscious effort to keep myself composed. I have to be strong enough to be taken seriously, but light enough as to not be labeled the angry Black woman. I have to be tough enough to respond firmly to racist behavior with my words, but not so tough that I'm threatening, because we've all seen what happens when Black people are assumed to be threatening. Being Black in a white space such as Maine is a balancing act of emotional steadiness that I work really hard to conquer. I can't just get mad and get upset without it turning into a potential situation. Black people have been murdered for much less than yelling at someone, and my mind is always on the what ifs before the scenario itself can even unfold. When it comes down to it, it really doesn't matter how much flannel I wear, or how often I wear my bean boots, or the fact that I can eat a lobster proudly without needing a bib or without needing instructions. I look different, and I am a different race. So to some people here, I will immediately be summed up as the enemy. The stares in the comments will always happen. Me asking my white friends to accompany me inside stores I'm not familiar with will always happen, but I do dream of the day that I can just blend into this community. I dream of the day I can be just like everyone else, the day that my skin color isn't seen as an immediate threat. It should not be a negative mark against who I am as a person before I can even open my mouth to introduce myself. I want to be comfortable driving past law enforcement, especially at night, without a pit in my stomach. And I want to be able to call them and know that they will protect me and not confuse me for the perpetrator and kill me before I can even get a sentence out to explain why I called them. I want to be equal, and I have wished for it my whole life. And yes, on a technical level, Black people and white people are equal. We can both vote. We can both own property. But think of all the Black people you know and the ones in your community. Do you really feel that we are equal to you? Do you really feel like there's been space that's been made for us? And do you really feel that we are all one within the community? Do you feel like there's been an active acceptance? Well, I still haven't learned how to respond to the racial slurs I've received and will continue to be told to go back where you came from by random strangers. Maine is my home. Just like you, I grew up here. Just like you, I love this state. And just like you, I belong here. I hope you will all open your minds and open your hearts to accept that, because there is room enough for the both of us. And really not just the both of us, there is plenty of room here for all of us. I really look forward to the day when my skin color is respected and supported by everyone that I meet. Our work here at GPCOG is to really take the first steps towards putting a lens to racial equity and inclusion within our region. We want to work with all of our members in having these open and honest conversations and doing the necessary work to support communities of color. And we are definitely not experts, and we are never going to claim to be, but we are ready to learn and we are ready to do the work. And I'll be the first to tell you that this is not going to be the most comfortable of conversations. There will be times when the incorrect thing is said. There will be times when you're going to have to choose between being comfortable and making real substantial change, because those two things are not always the same. It is definitely a choice and it's definitely a lifestyle change, but it's one that we're really hoping that you make with us as we dive into these long overdue conversations. The best way to tackle something new and unfamiliar is really to just meet it head on. So I look forward to hearing from all of you as we continue to scope our work plan internally, put procedures into place, and work to become a better and more supportive and more inviting place for all minorities. So without further ado, we have a really exciting program for all of you. It looks like there are 144 people here that are joining us. I know that some of you have questions, but we are going to wait until the end to do a question and answer period. So just save them for the end of our program. And it's my pleasure to introduce our fantastic moderator who will be facilitating this panel. His name is DWAYNE Marsh. DWAYNE has facilitated over 500 conversations regarding race in local government. And he also just completed a 4-year term at GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, as Deputy Co-Director. GARE works to normalize conversations about race and help local governments advance opportunities for all. So I'm really happy to have DWAYNE here to give a more in-depth look at the role that government can play in advancing racial equity. So we're gonna wait for DWAYNE to come up on screen, and then I will let him take it from here. And there he is. DWAYNE, go ahead and take it from here.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Tari, and thank you, Christina, for those really outstanding and powerful openings. And just to say that I may have facilitated 500 conversations on race with government officials in different jurisdictions, and we'll talk about that. But I learn something every time I have these conversations, and today already has been no exception. So thanks so much for setting the stage for this conversation. I'm going to be helping us think about the framing around these questions of race and equity and government, and then handing over the conversation to two really powerful speakers who will share their own experiences about that work. And I'm going to use a slide deck to begin, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to be able to do that, if you will. Oh, it looks like I'm disabled from screen sharing. Can I get the power? There we go. And we will get underway. So I should say a little something about myself. I grew up in the semi-segregated South in the 1970s, and I was surrounded by civil rights legends, actually, people who desegregated the Virginia schools, who actually fought legal and political advocacy to make sure that we could see equity as a way of life. And I just thought that's what people did for a living. And then I went off to school in the Northeast and realized not everybody does that for a living. But I decided I wanted to pursue that work. And so I've been doing a career in racial justice in a number of ways for the last 27 years. And so today, what I hope to help us do is get some understanding of the role government plays in contributing to racial inequity and our responsibility to advance racial equity. Develop a little bit of a shared analysis on the issue of racial equity in government, and gain increased understanding of how the public sector can advance racial equity. At a glance, we've just heard amazing introductions and how we wrestle with this moment. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes giving a little bit of a primer on governing for racial equity. And then we'll have some reflections from the field. Bill Webster, who used to be a Lewiston Superintendent of Schools, will be on board, as well as Claude Rwaganje. He is a city councilor at large of the city of Westbrook, amongst many other roles that he plays. And then we'll have a little time for dialogue with the presenters and questions for moving forward. Always like to talk about the learning environment. Even in these virtual settings, we heard about how this can be an uncomfortable topic. So just making sure that we have a way to have that conversation. Take space, make space means when you're in conversation, make sure that you have room to learn and experience. Make sure that you share your perspectives, but don't take too much of the air. Anticipate that discomfort that was described before, because sometimes that means you're in a growing edge. You're learning something that you didn't know before, didn't recognize, and it's helping you to evolve your work. We want to build and maintain brave space. This notion that, in fact, taking on the work of addressing race is a courageous act, and that's the posture we want to have as we get into this activity and these kinds of conversations. Own and honor your emotions. You will feel things deeply, and you need to have a good sense of where you are in that process to be able to be an active contributor, participant in a conversation, and when you need to take space, knowing that you need to do that. We often say what is said stays, what is learned leaves. Of course, this is a public webinar, but what we mean by that is stories, incidents will come up. The lessons learned from those stories are the important factor. It's not just about spreading it. You heard something about so-and-so, right? This is really about what can we learn from our experiences that helps us to grow and to do stronger work. And of course, embrace virtual space, which can mean, interruptions in Zoom, awkward pauses, et cetera. So those are the environments that we like to build. There are some assumptions that come to this work. Race matters, and we're seeing that nationally right now, that we're having a kind of referendum on race in our country. We can no longer pretend like this is not an issue. And we're not just talking about individual acts of bigotry, we're talking about systems, institutions, and structures that perpetuate inequity. And we have to recognize and acknowledge we are part of those systems and institutions. And we have a responsibility for advancing racial equity. So if you can hold those assumptions with me, then we can really get into this conversation. Now we're in this moment, right? Where the global pandemic is revealing just how pervasive racial inequities are. We've seen that the people who are Black and brown in this country are bearing the brunt of this work. Our national and global economies are cratering to a staggering degree, and again, disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities. The epidemic of systemic racism is now coming to the forefront. Through policing, it's now ignited unprecedented national protest, and we're seeing national perspectives on race, the most dramatic shift in almost 60 years. And we have a crisis of democracy, really a challenge. Are we going to hold on to that framework that is supposed to be what we aspire to as a nation? And so we face unimaginable responsibility in trying to contend with some of the greatest constraints ever. Government has a role to play in this. There's some values and realities that we have to hold on to and think about that drive that work. All men are created equal. Think about the Declaration of Independence, an incredible aspiration, and yet it has a basic inequity built into it because of the 3/5 compromise, that in fact, it wasn't all men who were created equal, and it was only men. And so that inequity and that paradox is carried through us. It's the unresolved challenge of democracy that we still have to address today. With liberty and justice for all. We all used to say this when we did the Pledge of Allegiance growing up as a kid, but I know as an 8-year-old in Richmond, Virginia, I would look around and that frame didn't apply to my community. There's something structurally wrong when an 8-year-old can look at an aspirational statement like that in the Pledge of Allegiance and recognize it's not happening for all of us. And then government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, from the Gettysburg Address. Really the top aspiration of what government could be from that famed address. And we know, in fact, that's an aspiration we haven't actually achieved. We can look at government's history and note that explicitly it played a role in creating and maintaining racial inequity. This isn't a debate or a point of view or perspective, it's historical fact. And we deal with that legacy as government, even if we are as progressive as is possible in this day and age. We know that work went from being explicit to implicit after the progress of the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination, but basically also muted the conversation on race. And so government entities stopped talking about how race was affecting their policies and practices. And as we know, if you don't really have intentionality around your efforts on anything, you're not going to make the progress you want. And so we saw that some of the same inequities from the civil rights movement have not really shifted that greatly 60 years later to today. But what we've seen more recently is a real pattern of governing for racial equity, proactive policies, practices, procedures that center race in decision-making and help us understand how we can change outcomes. And that's the conversation we want to move into. Some people say, well, yeah, is it race or is it class? Is it gender? Is it, there's so many disparities and marginalizations. Well, that's all true. But we lead with race often, and this is why. Racial inequities, they're deep and they're pervasive. You can take another marginalization, heterosexism, sexism, ableism. If you disaggregate by race, you will see disproportionate impact within that particular marginalization. We cannot get to equity if we don't solve for racial equity. And racial anxiety is on the rise. It's often the elephant in the room. Now the elephant is blaring and we have to deal with it. So we have to figure out how to deal with anxiety. We also know that institutional and structural approach can be used in this arena that could help with other areas of marginalization, but specificity matters. If I were to say to you, I want equity for everyone forever, odds are I wouldn't get equity for anyone anytime soon. We have to be targeted. We have to be fixed in our goals. We have to have a North Star to which we are working toward. And so we lead with race often, center that in our work to address all inequities. It's not exclusive. We bring an intersectional analysis. So nationally, what we've seen is best practice that looks at normalizing conversations, operationalizing systems, and organizing for change. What do we mean by that? We have to normalize the conversation, have a shared analysis and definitions, and means we have to think about what we think we mean when we say what's happening in a racial situation. And it could be an individual act of bigotry. It could be a system that is out of sync. It could be an institution that we feel like has practices that are perpetuating inequities. All of those are true, but we have to make sure we're talking about the same thing. Otherwise, we can't have strategies that are aligned. And we have to hold urgency and priority. Sometimes it feels like this is going to take, it took us 350 years to get here. It's going to take us that long to resolve it. We don't have that kind of luxury. People's lives literally being lost today because of that. Now, if you can build that urgency, if you can normalize the conversation, then you can operationalize. Look at tools, data that can actually help you understand what strategies you need and drive results. But in doing that, what you often find is you have to organize. And this isn't just about organizing and community organizing as we think about it, which is hugely important. But it's also about how do we look at our own internal systems, operate differently within departments, look how change our infrastructure, recognize we can't do everything alone, so we have to partner with others. And ultimately, it comes back to community and their ability to govern, lead, and have power. And that sharing of power between government and residents is the ultimate kind of touchstone of if we're organizing properly. And I'll say, that moment when you think you've been organizing and making relationships with community and they jam you because they don't agree with what you're doing, that's when you're starting to make real progress towards advancing racial equity. All of this towards the notion of visualizing the kind of communities we want to create. So when we say normalizing, what do we really mean? Well, for example, equity, equality, we hear these terms bandied about all the time. And back in the day when we used to go out to places and we weren't all locked in our apartments and houses, if you went to a long-term event, a sporting event or a concert, ultimately there'd be an intermission and you'd go to the bathroom, right? And we'd find different length queues for men and women. And you start to unpack that and you'd ask yourself, why is that? Why is there only men and women's bathrooms? But that's another part of the conversation. But what we found was often the difference in experience leads to different outcome, right? Same number of stalls in many cases, women's lines longer because the experience of using the restroom is often a little different for women than it is for men. And so the first thing we recognize is we have to think of the experience of the affected community if we're actually going to be able to have equitable outcomes. And so that leads us to say, what do we do about this? Because while the women are stuck in this queue, the men are often waiting for the women they care about. And so this is something we have to hold. When a system is broken, generally it's disproportionately broken for a particular group, in this case, women. But the reality is it's probably broken for everyone. And so we can actually improve outcomes for everyone if we deal with the marginalized population. So we could say, well, let's change the number of stalls. Maybe that could get the ratio right. But then you ultimately start to think, well, why are we defining the conversation in this way? Why is this the kind of bathroom situation we have to have? And that leads us to thinking about other people who need to be benefited as well. And leads us to thinking about the way in which we can actually change our definitions. And this is the third thing to hold. Sometimes if you want to get a better result or outcome answer to a question, maybe you need to change the question. And so this notion of how we get to the root of how things happen, to get to understandings of how we're having these differences is really critical to how we think about racial inequities and how we address those. So racial inequity in the US, as we're seeing, literally from life to death, determines how well you do. From infant mortality to life expectancy, race will show you how your life's going to look and everything in between, right? From jobs, education, housing, arts, criminal justice. If you are Black or brown in this country, you are going to have more severe outcomes based on your race. And we know that's not natural. We know that disparities aren't naturally occurring, they are created. We have to figure out why they're happening and interrupt them. So what does that mean? It means we have to close the gap so race does not predict one's success while improving outcomes for all people. But to do that, we have to target strategies to focus improvements for those worse off. We have to move beyond services and focus on changing policies, institutions, and structures, right? So if I said in Greater Portland's Unified School District, I wanted to address equity, and the whites were achieving 75% graduation rate from high school on time, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans were graduating at 55%. Success would not be that everyone graduates at 70%. That would be compromise. We want to see everyone graduate at 80, 85, 90%. But to do that, we have to figure out why are certain populations graduating at a lower rate and address that, or we'll never get to the goal that we want. I was reflecting, I was in LA once doing a conversation, and one of your own, Bayard Love, was there, and he was talking to more than 700 managers for the 111,000 employees of the county of Los Angeles that started to embark on this journey a couple of years ago. And he said, I'm from Maine, and we're very white, and we used to think that we were white because we didn't have any racial, so white we didn't have any racial inequity. He said, and then one day we realized maybe we're so white because we have racial inequities, and that's why people aren't here. And so it's really important to think about that, and that notion that we have to understand the most marginalized, the most invisible in our communities to figure out how it is that we can improve their lives. So a couple of things I want to make sure we hold as concepts as we hear from our speakers. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of diversity, equity, inclusion, and this is an important foundation to build on, and you do this work. Some of you probably have been involved in these kind of initiatives. Recognize it's a foundation, but it's not enough, right? Often equity is the silent part of this, right? We'll do diversity work and inclusion work, we don't get to equity. Diversity just measures the quantity of people in the room. Did we get the mix changed? 40 years ago, if we were having this conversation, there may be no people of color in the room. That's not good. And we have changed and moved that significantly. We've improved the diversity. It doesn't guarantee we get the outcomes we want. Then people got in the room and we said, well, are they having agency? Can they actually influence the conversation? Are they able to share their perspectives? The quality, also important, but again, does not guarantee the outcomes we want. Equity says, we're going to start with the focus on justice, the outcomes we want to see, and figure out what it will take for us to get there. And that's really what's important for us to think about when you hear about diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, we could spend the whole day talking about bias, but we're just going to take a minute. And I'll just say, we all have bias. This is a scientific fact. It's how our brains function, the making judgments and comparing one thing to another. But the thing to hold is that some kinds of bias can actually be harmful. And so in the work of governing for racial equity, we look at two kinds of bias in particular we have to be vigilant for. Explicit bias, implicit bias. Explicit bias is directly expressed. The person who's wielding it knows exactly what they're doing, and we do too, right? So if I own an apartment building and I put a sign in the window that says whites only, everybody knows what I mean. I know what I mean. There's an explicit bias I have for whites against others. That's what I want to see happen in my apartment building. But if it's implicit bias, it's expressed differently, indirectly. I may not even be aware that I'll have this bias and it's operating subconsciously, but the net effect can be the same. That same building, I might never put a whites only sign up, but if I instinctively do more property criminal background checks on African Americans, other people of color than whites, then inadvertently, I may create the same outcome because that invites bias from other systems like the criminal justice system or the education system. And ultimately, it may be a higher barrier for those people to get into that apartment than it is for whites. And this is hugely important because in the arena of government, typically what we are encountering is implicit bias. And implicit bias is deeply informed by our culture surroundings and the inputs that we receive in ways that we're not even recognizing we're receiving it. And so it's really critical that we recognize that we have to address implicit bias in our work, because if we don't, we won't get there. As far as I know right now, there's not a government in the country that's interviewing people saying, do you have strong specific biases against people of color? And they say yes, and they go, oh great, you're hired. That's not what we're up against, right? We're up against the implicit bias that says that in fact, we will make decisions and judgments without even recognizing we're making them. The other thing to hold about bias is that unfortunately, thinking you can deny it or suppress it actually makes it worse. It kind of enhances or amps our prejudice rather than get rid of it. So we have to openly acknowledge and challenge it exists and then develop strategic interventions to address that. The good news is we know how to do that, right? We can actually look at our own work and say, what kinds of policies are we creating at an institutional level, at an individual level, explicitly, implicitly, and we can think about the policies that may come out of that. And in this chart, and if you ever go back to your own jurisdiction and play with this chart right here, Focus on the institutional implicit, policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally, because that's where, if you do a kind of census or survey of your work and look for bias in your work, this is where the vast majority will happen. And that's an activity you can actually do and figure out how you move to that. To do that, it really is good to get bias training, which we can talk about during the conversation. So those definitions I mentioned, again, individual racism, bigotry, discrimination against an individual based on race, deplorable, not acceptable, often happens, but it's not the thing in government that we're really up against. It's the institutional racism, policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. And that's where, if we don't address those, they create a system, structural racism, that's the history and current reality of our institution across all institutions, combining to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. I come out of the house on Monday, I don't get to say, well, I'm gonna choose to deal with housing on Monday, I'm gonna look at transportation on Tuesday, arts on Wednesday, food systems on Thursday, and law enforcement on Friday. Those things are happening concurrently. And if each of those systems has bias, has discrimination, has policies that impact me along the way, it creates an oppressive environment. It's gonna be very difficult for me to survive and prosper in this country. Now, other thing about this is, again, asking different questions. Often we fall into this frame of blame, and what was the intention, what prejudice did you have, and what the grievances are that you have. Those things are real, but if we start to think about cause, what causes our inequities, what are the effects of those inequities, impact matters. What systems are as responsible, what are the solutions? It can elevate the conversation to a place where we can actually start to take action. And that's really important for us to do. So I want to spend just a moment talking about how, if you could normalize the conversation, and that was 17 minutes and 10 seconds of a 2-day seminar. So we really flew over that. But if you were actually to start to operationalize the systems, what would that mean? It would mean that the institutional policies that we tend to create would start to have equitable impact. That the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't have created policies like the GI Bill that actually only gave 3% of its money to soldiers of color returning home, and set up the middle class structurally in the 1940s in a way that we were guaranteed to have the inequities we see in neighborhoods today. That the interstate system wouldn't actually have become a pathway to segregation and ultimately displacement and gentrification, ultimately revitalization that displaces communities. That our location of city facilities would not be able to know that when you look at this map of DC and you see those trash transfer stations all in the dark green, you know who lives in those neighborhoods. That would not happen if we actually were to operationalize racial equity. And so there are tools you can use to keep race at the center of decision-making for your policies, practices, and individual culture, organizational culture. Thing to know, these are not just made up. They've grown from a field of practice. They're now being adopted widely in the public sector. The organization I worked with, GARE, now has more than 200 members of all sizes working across the country to figure out how to use these. And it benefits from improved transparency with community partners, and it's critical to employ in times of crisis. So it really helps with this notion of operationalizing systems that I talked about. And it helps us to actively insert racial equity into the decision-making process. Now, everyone should be able to use these tools. Elected officials, government staff, community, to be able to communicate and move that work. And briefly, what I want to say about that is that it helps you to actually change your decision-making and make the cumulative impact of many small choices to be as significant as the impact of big decisions. There are multiple steps in applying racial equity analysis. We can share with you, everyone in the call, a couple of options for that. But in essence, it is looking at the desired results you want to achieve from a racial equity perspective, understanding what the data tells you about that incident or situation, what data you're missing, real authentic communication and engagement with community. Then only after you do those things do you start to talk about what strategies could advance racial equity, and think about how you mitigate for unforeseen circumstances and bring in partners, because we know it's going to have to be complementary work. Think about your implementation plan and make sure it's feasible, and make it feasible. And then how do you communicate and keep accountable, in fact, so you can restart the process. And if nothing else, you want to be sure to ask the question, who benefits, who's burdened by this decision? That alone can be a transformative conversation for you in doing this work. So that's the frame I wanted to share with you around thinking about this work. And I know we're gonna have an amazing conversation with our presenters. And with that, I think I will turn it back to Tori to introduce and cue up our first reflector.
Thank you, DWAYNE, so much. That was absolutely amazing. I'm looking forward to going over your PowerPoint again and again. That was fantastic. And I know there are still a lot of questions. And again, I do want to just reiterate the fact that we will definitely try and go into a question answer period at the end of the webinar, just to give everyone time to present. But DWAYNE, thank you again so much. And going right into our first panelist, I have the pleasure of introducing Bill Webster. He is the former superintendent of the Lewiston School District. Bill was nice enough to share his time with us, and he'll be sharing his own personal story and experience of dealing with race and inclusion. So I really look forward to hearing from Bill, and we will wait to see if we can have him pop up on the screen here, and then I'll let him take it away. There he is. Hi, Bill. Thank you.
Hi, Tori. Thank you very much, and I'm honored to be part of this webinar. I am white, obviously. I'm a male. I was born and raised in Maine, went to school in Maine, and I'd like to share some of my experiences that may represent a road that some of you have already been on. Maybe some of you are yet to be on it. Maybe your road will be different, but hopefully you'll learn something from me. I'm going to share 6 or 7 things of what I used to believe and what I believe now. And in doing that, hopefully you'll find some insights that are helpful to you. So I want to emphasize that this is my story. Yours will be different. But at the same time, I hope that something here will resonate with you either today or perhaps sometime in the future. I also want to emphasize that this is a lifelong journey. So what I believe today is still evolving, and if I were to present to you a year from now, I suspect it would be different. So one of my beliefs growing up and well into my adulthood was the belief that Maine was exemplary in its history. Now, I know and I believe that Maine is a great state, but it has its own share of racism. We've seen a pig's head rolled into a mosque in Lewiston. We've seen KKK flyers in Freeport in recent years. There's a picture of a KKK march. It took place in Milo, Maine, with over 400 participants, all wearing white hoods. So here's the picture of the march in Milo, Maine. Now, I saw this picture for the first time just a couple of years ago. If I had seen this growing up, I wonder if my thinking about our state would have been a little different. The second belief that I'd like to share with you is that I used to believe that racism is only taught. Now I believe that we're all wired to have bias against those physically different than we are. And one of the things that I want to mention is that over my last 2 years in Lewiston, on a monthly basis, we had racial dialogue with my administrative team, representing anyone who supervised teachers and staff in Lewiston Public Schools. And halfway through this 2-year process, we had a presentation by a firm in Portland called Mindbridge. And I would strongly recommend listeners may want to explore getting in touch with them. What they presented was clear research that made it well understood and known that we all have biases, often unconscious biases. And if you think about it, most of our roots in generations and generations, eons ago, we were in tribes. And for our own protection, we had to have antennas go up if we saw people that were different than we were. Those wires still exist in our brain. Many of us are not even aware of them. And we have to work very hard to weed out that unconscious bias. When many of my administrators heard this presentation for the first time, there was relief in that they didn't have to feel that the label racist was because of their beliefs in something they did. Now there was an understanding that we all have this bias and we have to work hard at it. So Mindbridge, a firm in Portland that I strongly recommend. The next belief I'd like to share is this belief that I should be colorblind when it comes to color of skin. Now I believe I must be conscious of race. Because if I'm not conscious of race, then I'm minimizing everything that's happened over the last 400 years to people of color. And this has been a change because I used to take pride in, I'm colorblind. I treat everyone equal without regard to the implicit biases that exist throughout our culture, in our institutions. Another belief is in regard to history. I used to believe that we should teach African American history. Obviously, there's a story there. But now I believe that Black history is an integral part of all our history. And the picture that I'm sharing here is from Malaga Island, a poor Black or mixed race family that lived there at the turn of the century. Many of you probably now know the story about how the state of Maine basically forcefully removed every occupant of that island. And some went to the school for feeble-minded in Pineland, and others were integrated throughout other towns in the area. And this sad story was not well known until the last 10 to 15 years. Again, whites were the cause of what happened on Malaga Island. And just to think, if this story had been taught early on in our educational system, how we might be in a different place today. The next belief that I'd like to share is that I used to believe that I'm a good judge of what is offensive. Now I believe the minority must be the judge. Here's a picture of cheerleaders at Skowhegan Area High School. Their mascot for years was the Indians. And probably most of you know the story. Just in the last year or so, they finally voted the school board there to do away with the Indian mascot. And also there's a state law that was forcing them to do that. This, I think, is an important issue throughout the United States today. We look at statues, mascots, dress. There's this concern about political correctness voiced by some, cultural appropriation. But to me, it's, as some of our speakers have already put in words, we need to put ourselves, and it's impossible for us to put ourselves in the shoes of a minority and what they've experienced in life. Therefore, they must be the judge of these situations. That's one of my beliefs. The next belief I'd like to talk about is white privilege. I used to believe that some poor whites do not have white privilege. Now I believe that all whites have white privilege, although I do wish that perhaps there were a different word. Now I'd like to share a Facebook post that I received from one of my teachers. She wrote, "The facilitator spoke to a group of teacher leaders about white privilege. My guard instantly came up. Privilege? I don't have white privilege. I grew up on the tree streets in downtown Lewiston. My father, a French Canadian, hardworking man, was harassed and ridiculed for his speech. My parents worked hard and we didn't have a lot of money. But I get it now. I listened, I learned, I am still learning." And what I have pictured here reads, "White privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It means that your skin color isn't one of the things making it harder." And I just made a list of a few things that resonated with me on this topic. When I wake up in the morning, I don't think about my race. I don't think that's the case with many blacks in Maine. I can dress casually and still be treated with respect. I'm never called an immigrant or an illegal. I'm not monitored in stores, nor are my bags checked. I can choose not to talk about politics. I'm not held accountable for others in my community. No one questioned me about whether I was qualified for my position. And then, as a white, I'll be never labeled a terrorist. I used to believe that we needed to focus on changing the minds of those that are racist. And because growing up in Maine, perhaps it wasn't until I got to college that I started hearing racist jokes and seeing a few examples of racism. And in my mind, it was, these individuals are doing something wrong and we need to focus on changing those behaviors. It wasn't until much later in life that I realized the systemic racism that is found in most all our institutions, in our numerous laws and regulations and practices. And my belief now is that we need to weed out that systemic racism. Among the books that we read with my administrators, and there are many books out there, I'm not necessarily recommending one book, but was a book entitled Waking Up White. And this notion that, again, whites, when we wake up in the morning, we don't think about our race, but if we did and better understood why we are where we are, we would realize that the GI Bill discriminated against people of color. Many things in the New Deal discriminated against people of color. The fact that the New Deal exempted jobs that were typically held by Black Americans. And this is what we need to be focusing on. And I think so many of you as leaders in your communities are in a position to focus on the systemic racism. Now, I see 3 steps to change. There are at least 3 things that resonated with me in our work at Lewiston. One, we needed to better understand, to use data, including anecdotal data, by race. We needed to reflect on the information. We needed to have training and a dialogue with those people that were going to use it. And then we needed to identify action steps. So among the things we did in Lewiston was to begin to track students by race, relating it to discipline, relating it to course completion, grades, graduation rate, and similar data. We also began to track race by employment, including candidates that were interviewed, hires, and our overall employee census. It was clear we could not argue that a greater percentage of our Black students were being suspended. We were fortunate that we didn't see a difference in graduation rates. And that was in large part, I think, due to our ethnic community that was so committed, our immigrants that were so committed and saw education as the key to their children's success. We also realized, and some of this was anecdotal and we're still improving reporting, that our Black teachers, and they were few, but our Black teachers did not have the suspension rates of Black students that our white teachers did overall. And the research is clear that students do better, people do better, if they see at least a few teachers or staff that they're working with that come from similar backgrounds. In our dialogue, 2 years of dialogue with administrators on a monthly basis, including book reads, guest speakers. And for many of them, it took that 2 years to be in a position to feel, I am ready to be a leader of systematic change in our schools. And that may be too long, but for many people, this is a tough journey and not something that's going to happen overnight. When I was leaving, we were beginning to roll out this to all staff. But just like this notion of white privilege that I've already talked about, staff needs to be trained to better understand that, to better understand about if they are white, no matter their circumstances, that they have white privilege. In terms of some of the action steps that came up that we did, we implemented and are still in the process when I left a year ago of implementing restorative practices, restorative justice in our schools. This is the same type of program that has been discussed and sometimes used by law enforcement in our prison system, and something that starts out with getting to know people, to understand who they are, where they're coming from, and to hear their viewpoint before we jump to conclusions. We also worked with USM in their urban teacher development program. Teachers that are going to be working in urban environments are dealing with different situations, and that's an important program for at least a community like Lewiston. And something else we did was we took the initiative in identifying staff or residents that were interested in becoming teachers, but had a road to go down before they got there. And we instituted a teacher diversity initiative. It was, while it was still open to everyone, we had about 15 positions per year, and the vast majority of those were immigrants and other people of color. So that is a little bit of my journey. I hope that you find something there that is helpful. And if something comes up and you would like to email me, it will be on the website, I believe, but bwebsterjr@gmail.com, bwebsterjr@gmail.com, and I'd be pleased to offer my insights, however narrow or focused they might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, so much. We really appreciate that. And again, just to reiterate what he said, we are going to put this up at the end, but any questions that any of you have for any of our panelists or any of us at GPCOG, we'll put an email up that is our general inbox so that you'll be able to send us any questions that you have, or if you'd like to get in touch with the speakers, you can send us a request and we'll try and put you in touch with them. So we'll put that information up at the end as well. So thank you again, Bill. Really appreciate your time. And our last panelist, last but not least, is a familiar face that I'm sure many of you know, Claude Rwaganje, Westbrook City Councilor. He'll be sharing his experiences living in Maine as an elected official of color and as a father. And Westbrook is one of our member municipalities here at GPCOG. So again, a familiar face. We're really excited to have Claude here with us, and we will hopefully get him up here on screen, and then I will let him take it away. There he is. Hello, Claude. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Tori, for a wonderful introduction, and thank you, GPCOG, for giving me this opportunity to share my personal story and to join this important conversation to talk about race, racial equity, and inclusion. It's very hard to follow Tori, Bill, and DWAYNE. I think I'm intimidated here, but I'll try my best. I was born and grew up in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I came to the United States in 1996. I encountered many barriers, including but not limited to English language or snow, coming from Congo where it's 70 to 90 degrees year round, and coming to a minus some degrees, it was also hard. Some culture shock, and also being away from my own families was very hard. You can imagine going to a foreign country, how it will look like when you can't speak the language, you don't know the culture, and you don't look like those people that you're going to live with. Don't take me wrong. Maine is a nice place to live and a nice place to raise children, but it has also its own challenges. After 24 years, I'm still facing some integration challenges. Today, I was asked to talk about my personal experience as a person of color, a father, and elected officials and immigrants. Let me share a little bit of story. Early this March, in March of this year, I was invited by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to the annual conference in Mississippi. The conference was great, and I was very impressed by the wonderful presentation from people from all over the world. But I was shocked to see something I have never seen since I came to this country, which gave me a sense of other part of the country other than Maine and northern Maine. As soon as I entered the taxi cab, the driver started telling me about the history of Mississippi. And within 5 minutes, I saw a Confederate flag floating at the city hall. I asked him why this flag, which I know its history, is still up at the city hall. He replied by his own word, and I quote, "The legislature and even voters have tried a few times, but they have failed to shut it down." And he said, I quote again, "To some white people, mostly white supremacists, it was symbolic, but to Black people, it was bad memory about slavery." I was very pleased to hear that last week, Governor signed bills to remove that. But it was not an easy task. It came after many people have tried so hard to advocate, including some sports, to say they won't play any sport in that state unless the flag was removed. It's hard to talk about race and social justice and equity without talking about the long history of racism, like what I just said. And I don't think I'm qualified to talk about this history, as Tori has said, DWAYNE and others. But let me share my family experience with the killing of George, which, by the way, I know many of you know. It was horrible, painful, and hard to watch, especially when we had to watch it with our own children and to be able to answer the questions from our children. And what is this? And why is this happening? I was curious to understand why this incident happened. And I read, according to many reports, police were called to the Cub Food store on the corner of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis on May 25th, which was a Memorial Day, to report a man who was using fake bills to buy a pack of cigarettes. I want to highlight this word, a bill and a pack of a cigarette, according to 911 transcript. Watching what happened in that video, if you haven't watched it, please, I will ask if you review that again to understand the pain and what a man, a husband, a Black person went through because of $20 bill. It's painful. It's very painful. And you know what followed, all of you, and the impact that 20 bill or a pack of cigarette has had in this country and across the globe. Couple weeks following the killing of George Floyd, every evening, my family and I would watch the news. We saw peaceful demonstrations with small group of people burning and looting businesses. I said to my sons, that's wrong. Why should they do that? And my sons push back and say, Dad, you don't get it. This is a history of 400 years. It has happened for 400 years. And that's why this is an anger and this is frustration of those so many years. Since then, we have seen many businesses and the municipality releasing statements in support of Black Lives Matter and condemning the killing of George Floyd. Is that enough? Releasing a statement is a first step, but the most important is what action would be taken following this statement. Change will not happen overnight. It requires stakeholders to agree that change needs to happen, as you have heard from Tori and many others. This is a tough conversation to have. Some municipalities are limiting this discussion by revisiting the police use of force or defund the police. The conversation is bigger than that. We need to investigate a system, and I underline the system that was built to favor certain individuals over others. We are talking about abolishing racism, disparities that exist in healthcare, employment, police policies, housing, and many other things. Just because I'm Black, I cannot run in my neighborhood without being judged as a suspect or terrorist. That is wrong, and people should not be judged by the color of their skin. Racial equity is about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to a system that has been out of balance. When a system is out of balance, people of color feel the impact. But to be clear, an imbalanced system makes all of us pay. I saw this in Rwanda, where almost 1 million people were killed during the genocide in 1994, just because they were Hutu and Tutsi. And by the way, this was a history from the Belgium who colonized the country, who told the Hutu that they were inferior to the Tutsi. And they grew up knowing that the Tutsi are enemies. I see the same thing in the Congo, where my own tribe as a Banyamulenge have been in existence since 1885. But just because we speak the language of Rwandan or Tutsi, we are discriminated at because we are Rwandese. We should go back to Rwanda. I'm happy that I'm out of that place. But again, that's when the system is in imbalance, all of us pay the price. Let me say a few words about the consequence of racial equity. All of you have seen, it's not a secret to anybody, that's Maine deep COVID-19 racial disparities. We are now at the top of the map in this whole US. The current public health emergency caused by COVID-19 and the resulting economic recession is harming Black and African-American men, as well as other racial diverse communities. But let me tell you what broke my heart during all these issues. I received a phone call from my own niece who told me that she had a baby after getting a C-section. And the same day, her husband was testing COVID-19. I tried very hard to isolate the husband, even though the husband was a person who was helping the wife and the 2 years old and one day daughter. Unfortunately, after working to send this person into a quarantine place, 3 days later, I was called by the same niece who told me, you know what? I think we sent my husband too late. Now I have tested positive with my 1 week baby. That was devastating. I have never heard about 2 weeks old baby with COVID-19. This disparity is rooted in systemic racism. While this disease is a new pandemic, these disparities are not new. Black, African Americans communities, Latin communities, and other communities of color are at great risk of COVID for many reasons. including but not limited to lack of access to comprehensive health care that can prevent or manage chronic disease that make people more vulnerable to COVID-19 disease, like diabetes, heart disease, and asthma. Language and culture barrier can make it a challenge for immigrants and other people of color to participate in testing and contact tracing or get appropriate information about the virus. Working frontline and high-risk jobs that do not allow for social distancing or have high contact with the public. Recent analysis revealed that Black workers, women, and immigrants are most likely to hold jobs on the front line of the coronavirus fight. When all of us are in our homes, these poor people are actually working. This includes jobs in healthcare, direct care services or group home, food processing, and retail. Many of these low-wage workers do not have access to paid sick days or pay leave that would allow them to stay home if they are at high risk or if they feel symptoms. Some are excluded from the unemployment insurance system and have no income option if they must stay home or lose their job due to the virus economic shutdown. Many of these workers lack adequate protection in the workplace to keep them safe. Low-income workers are also more likely to need to use the public transportation or carpool to get to work, which also increases the exposure. Lack of safe housing is a challenge. Just today at 9:30, when I was trying to put this presentation together, I received a call from an immigrant fellow who told me he just got the result and tested positive. And he needed a place to quarantine. I said, I put all this presentation on the side and I wanted to do this referral immediately. Because based on what he told me, and it's a reality, it's true, he lived with his wife and 2 kids and 2 elderly, 85 and 70 years old people in the same house. The fear of contacting them with the virus, I had to put this down and work around finding a place for him to quarantine. People of color, and especially Black, indigenous, African American, are also disproportionately harmed by our policing and incarceration system. We heard that from DWAYNE and many others. Disparities already exist in our education system for people of color and immigrants. Solution must be led by those from the communities most impacted. I don't think anybody knows our own challenges and our own culture more than ourselves. While some local municipalities in the state try to find some solution to address the growing disparities, those solutions have failed to reduce the disparities. Too often, the department or city decides what they believe are the right solution or create system without adequate guidance and input from the people who are supporting these communities on the ground. My colleagues and I have been meeting since March. It has been 15 weeks with very limited resources to try to educate, to provide outreach, and also to do this shelter in place to our members of the communities. But I think the cities will have a better chance, including the state, to partner with us to be able to address these disparities. I will urge and ask that the Maine government to confront and end these harmful disparities. We must acknowledge, as a growing number of states and the municipalities have already done, that racism is a public health emergency. Municipalities should work directly, as I said, with community-based organizations who not only speak the language of the community members, but also understand their culture. Resources must be available at the city level or state. But remember that some of these people cannot pick up a phone or even go to the website to read and understand what's going on. The data is clear. We cannot ignore the growing disparities of Black, Latino, and other manners of color. What we are experiencing is unprecedented, but I will urge all the stakeholders, those who are listening, the pandemic is bigger than just health. We need to work together to fight it, and we need to work together at the municipal level, at the state level, to fight this COVID. And then open a longer conversation to discuss about race, social, economic, and justice that has affected for 400 years many individuals, including Black and many other minorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claude. And I really appreciate your also sharing your perspectives. We're going to actually take questions in the Q&A box. You can actually type your questions in directly and we'll get those answered. And I have a couple of questions that I want to ask our presenters as well. But first of all, we have a question. Is your niece doing okay? Someone wanted to know if how she's handling the situation right now. Claude, that's to you.
Yes, that was about probably 4 weeks ago that my niece and her two weeks old baby tested positive. Yes, they're doing great, and thank you for asking. However, there are so many, like my niece, like my family members who called today, who are still experiencing the same issues, that needs attention, that needs help. So please, if you can, let us come together as a community, as stakeholders, to address these disparities. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to give you just a moment, but I have one other question for Claude. And I know that Portland is an immigrant relocation center and therefore has an influx of immigrants coming into the community. And it got me thinking as you were talking, Claude, are there places, do immigrants experience places where they can actually connect and engage with mainstream population so you can start to build some relationships and associations? And if not, do you see how local governments can play a role in making those spaces possible?
That's a very, very good question. I remember some of the people probably who are on this call may recall that about 6 or 7 years ago, there was some discussion which actually started by Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition in partnership with some other local businesses to actually have an open discussion. What we saw was mostly immigrants and nonprofit organizations actually coming to these conferences. It was a series of 6 workshops that's actually happened at USM, which allowed us to discuss about issues of integration, economic integration, employment, and how immigrants who are actually working in these many businesses can come together. What we did not see in those instances were actually government officials, municipalities, and also businesses itself. So I think it's about time that we continue to open up this discussion, because immigrants right now are vital to the Maine workforce in Maine. Otherwise, if we don't have these immigrants working, if we don't talk about their language, if we don't understand their needs, it will be hard for us to be integrated. We have acknowledged and we continue to experience not only immigrants, many others who have said, these are people from away, or some even at the high level calling immigrants terrorists. that is not a welcoming environment that allows us to be able to discuss together, to be able to work together. I will welcome this kind of discussion between the GPCOG and our local municipalities to be able to work together. Again, as I said in my presentation, Maine is a welcoming city. We have seen what City of Portland have done after so many years with the Office of Economic Opportunities. We have seen how general assistance have been changed. We used to have people going to the general assistance at 2 in the morning, so just they can receive a voucher. There are some changes that are happening, but again, we still have a long work to do to be able to work together as a community. So yes, there is organization, mostly nonprofit organization, but again, as Christine said early, when we had the influx of asylum seekers, I applaud again GPCOG. We work together with them. Again, we work together with the Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition and many other businesses and organizations, many foundations that really stepped up to support this nonprofit. But we need the government, we need a municipality, we need a state to be also to work with us. I also want to say the governor did really a good thing during that influx of asylum seekers. She declared an emergency situation. That is what we are asking even today. That what happened at the expo was then, but today we have a pandemic. We need this to be an emergency situation, especially for people of color who have experienced these disparities that everybody have seen. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. And I'm gonna hope we can keep our answers to just a minute if we have 3 or 4 more questions. I wanna ask though, Bill, something really powerful you said. You talked about white privilege and the uncomfortableness of recognizing that. And then even as you went into it, you said, it wasn't until I got to college that I actually saw experiences of racial incidents. Itself a form of white privilege, to be able to get to 18 and not know what that means. So I just wanted to lift that up as a really powerful reflection you had. I'm curious, have you found spaces where white people are talking to each other about this in government or just in social settings? How do we start to have comfort embracing the discomfort of this reality?
That is also a good question. I think that in general, whites have great difficulty talking about race, and that includes those that would very much like to have such a conversation. But whites are often afraid of saying the right thing, the wrong thing rather. And I think that we need to work hard to create safe places where everybody can voice what they say and without fear. And strong facilitation, I think, can be very helpful. And that's what we did in Lewiston with my administrators. But I was always concerned about, and white privilege was a perfect example. If that wasn't presented to certain staff in the right context with the right facilitation and training, they would have been shut off. And I was very concerned about that.
Great. A couple of questions have come in. I'm going to answer just briefly, quickly, and I'm going to leave a couple minutes for next steps. Somebody asked, how do we address the symptoms and results of a broken capitalistic system when poverty exacerbates racial and social injustice? The short answer, of course, there isn't one, is that data and consistent strategies to get at the root cause of the disparities we see allow us to address systemic racism and begin to expose how our system needs to be changed. And that's kind of a moment we're in right now. And I know it's not a totally sufficient answer, but again, having this commitment to racial equity is a pathway to get there. Somebody asked about whether government officials listening to hearing from community when government has so much implicit bias and power. I would say this is why we try to approach a methodology that helps entire jurisdictions start to build racial equity analysis around their patterns of behavior, because then you actually can point to the institutions and structures that have to be changed versus having people think it's an individual action. Claude, I saw that you wanted to answer live a question about the event at USM.
Correct, and I was blinking, I'm sorry. This was the World Affairs Council, of which worked with Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition to actually address the immigration and integration of immigrants. So if you go to Google and try to find the series of immigration services, with the World Affairs Council of Government, you'll be able to see that the series of those webinars that happened back then that I was talking about. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to put one more question in the hopper for each of you to take a moment to answer, then we'll turn it back to Tori to wrap up the next steps. And by the way, I think questions that weren't answered in the chat box, I think we've committed to make sure we get answers back to people, so don't feel like your questions will go unanswered. Thank you so much for this presentation. A lot of the conversations addressing institutional racial disparities are geared towards some of the larger cities in Maine. I'm an officer in a smaller town, and part of a local conversation on how to do this in the smaller cities and towns. I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on this question. Any closing reflections on that question as we wrap up?
I don't have a good answer to that. I worked in Lewiston, Maine's second largest city, where 50% of the students in school were students of color. I think this shows, though, the importance of having conversation, because there may be implicit ways that some of our smaller communities are contributing to systematic racism without even knowing it. But I don't have a good answer.
Same here, but I think it's just so important that we look into this conversation that just started and get some guidance between those who with experience like DWAYNE and others. Again, the best way, the best approach for this issue is actually conversation that we just started. And again, I want to add one thing. Many municipalities and state are just showing that defunding the police or just looking at the policing issue of brutality is the only thing they can do. This is just bigger than that. So opening up a conversation and see how the system is built and who does it favors and not favor, I think is the best way to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just say in closing that I mentioned the membership of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity being more than 200 jurisdictions at this point. Minnesota has the second most jurisdictions in the network. And some people say, wait, Minnesota, but it's 114% white. I'm like, no, actually it's more like 84% and changing. But the point I want to make here is that there are a lot of towns and cities in Minnesota who are wrestling with this very question, and they're finding answers with each other, trying to figure out how to resolve it. How do you deal with a hyper minority population that's experiencing racial inequity? So I would invite jurisdictions to check out the work of GARE, see if they think that could be helpful for them. And I'd invite the COG to think about bringing this conversation to the forefront. I want to thank all of you for an amazing conversation and for the commitment to this work, and GPCOG in particular for giving us a space to have it. And with that, I'm either turning it back to Tori or Christina.
I think I'm closing out, right, Tori?
Yes, you are closing out. I did just want to reiterate before everyone leaves that we will again be taking any of the questions that didn't get answered to our info@gpcog.org email address. So feel free to share any questions, any comments, anything that you'd like us to pass on to the panelists to that email. And we'll put up a slide as well with that information, and as well as some of our next installments that we'll be working on. So again, I just wanted to come on and thank everyone for coming, and I will turn it back over to Christina for her closing remarks. So thank you.
Thanks, Tori, and thanks, Tori, DWAYNE, Claude, and Bill for sharing your insights, your thoughts, being courageous, being honest, being candid. I think it was moving and also really enlightening discussion today, and that's attested to by the number of texts and emails that I've been getting throughout this program from people thanking all of you for being part of this. We do have a webinar series on this. This is really the introduction to racial equity. And we have, I think, 3 or 4 more webinars that are planned. I think Tom will put that slide up so you can see what's coming your way. We, as municipal officials and staff, are going to be looking at doing a deeper dive on what cities and towns can do on employment in the workforce, on the things that we focus on regionally, on transportation, how our transportation decisions can advance racial equity, our zoning and our housing, of course. Then we'll be looking at general assistance and education and community. And thank you, Bill, for naming the things that have been done in Lewiston. We're going to do a deeper dive into how schools can play a role also in advancing racial equity. And then we'll also be doing some work on public safety and policing. I wanted to say that the way that GPCOG is approaching this, Tori's our project manager, but we're aligning our work around our strategic priorities. And our first one is to operate with excellence, and that means internally. So we as staff are going through our own journey of trying to learn more about this, bringing some facilitated help, taking a look at our hiring practices, and we're also encouraging all of our staff that manage programs to take a racial lens to the work that we do. So we offer small business loans. We do a lot of work in transportation and housing and land use. We're working in economic development. There are a whole variety of things that we do that we think that we can do better if we have an intentional focus on race. And then the last thing is to serve our members. And so we will be doing this webinar series for our members, but we also are curious about whether some of the municipalities would like to do a more in-depth dive, either on a multi-municipal basis or within your own community, to have conversations about racial equity. Again, we are not the experts that can facilitate those conversations, but we can partner with community-based organizations, with other national partners and experts who, and we can help organize the conversation. And Zoe Miller and her team did this on opioid misuse for several of you who have been paying attention. We worked in Falmouth and in Portland and in Gorham to have a municipal dialogue and then an action plan around how to reduce opioid misuse in our communities. And we think that that pilot could be applied for municipal dialogues. So if you are interested in that, and I know several communities have already reached out to us, let us know. We don't have the funding resources to do it, but if we have enough interest, we will go and fundraise so that we can help do that. So in conclusion, I wanted to again say we're approaching this all with a lot of humility because we don't know what we don't know. We appreciate any input that any of you have on what you think would be helpful if the role that we play as a white-led organization. What can we do to work with our municipalities to make this a more just region? So thanks again for participating. It was really thrilling and moving to hear from all the speakers, and I thank you once again. And everyone have a great day.